Hi, my name is Phillip Toney, and this is my oral portion for exam 2, or the final exam for wildlife behavior. Today, we're going to be talking about four main topics of discussion. The first is going to be about Dr. Marissa Sobolewski's Terry's lecture on chimpanzees, and specifically looking at hormone levels in regards to testosterone and cortisol, and what her findings were as far as different actions or life events that chimpanzees will go through and how it reacts or changes their hormones. The second topic of discussion is the brood parasite cowbirds. I looked specifically at screaming cowbirds, so we'll take a look at those. The third topic of discussion is about parental care in clownfish regarding males specifically. And then the fourth and final topic of discussion will be about the benefits of nature on mental health in human behavior. So, as I mentioned, the first topic of discussion is about Marissa Sobolewski Terry's lecture on chimpanzees and her findings in relation to their testosterone and cortisone levels. Cortisol levels. And she looked at a few different actions or events that take place and how those impact their levels of testosterone and cortisol. And she looked at boundary patrols, hunting, meat sharing, and then in her paper and lecture, she also talks about mating. But we will only be looking really at the boundary patrols, hunting, and meat sharing. So to jump right into the boundary patrols, this is where the chimpanzees will go out from the area that they live and do exactly what it sounds like. They're patrolling the boundary of the territory that they see as their home territory. And when they take part in these boundary patrols, she found that their testosterone levels increased before, during, and after the boundary patrols. And it was a fairly marked spike in testosterone levels during those 3 periods of time. On days where there were no boundary patrols, she saw that the levels were at a normal level or were lessened compared to when they were on the boundary patrols. And that's how she was kind of able to compare those levels of days where they were compared to days where they weren't, and noticed that during, before, and after, those testosterone levels were all heightened. Cortisol levels were also increased before, during, and after patrols on the boundary patrol days. And this kind of makes sense when you take into account that cortisol levels tend to increase during times of stress. And I'll talk a little bit on the next slide about how I think the cortisol levels increasing and in relation to their stress matches up with what you would kind of expect in a situation like that. But just to briefly touch on it now, it does make sense given that during these boundary patrols, there is a chance or at least the possibility that the chimpanzees could come into contact with other groups. And so I think they're at a heightened kind of level of awareness and stress, really, and that's why we see those rises in cortisol. As far as hunting goes, the cortisol levels were also elevated before, during, and after hunts. Again, makes sense. It can be stressful because they're either going to eat or not eat, and there's also, again, that chance of conflict. So during hunts, to see the increased cortisol levels is expected, but one of the things that was unexpected, and she mentions that in her writing, and I also as the reader felt that way, is that the testosterone levels during hunting were actually lower. And you would expect that, much like the boundary patrols, it would actually be higher, but in reality, she found that testosterone levels dipped during hunts. As far as meat sharing goes, the cortisol levels weren't really discussed, and she pretty much focused on the testosterone levels as far as meat sharing. And what she found was that the testosterone levels drop during this time of meat sharing after a successful hunt. And one of the terms and concepts that she discusses here is tolerance. And this is basically the tolerance that the chimpanzee who's sharing the meat has for those that they're sharing it with. One of the other concepts that she mentions here is the concept of expected theft. So there is a theory that the chimpanzees who do not have meat are just going to steal it anyways, and so there are chimps that do have meat that will actually share that meat in the expectation that if they don't, the meat will just get stolen anyways. And so those two concepts were discussed during that time. And the other thing of note here is that the testosterone levels dropping during this meat sharing was really only observed in the chimpanzees that were either sharing the meat or that were receiving the shared meat. So if it was a chimpanzee who was not part of a trade-off or part of the meat sharing, their testosterone levels didn't necessarily drop. They would remain kind of at the same level. As far as what this signifies in chimpanzee behavior, this is what I mentioned a little bit on the previous slide. But I think that this shows that chimpanzees kind of have an anticipatory or situational awareness of what they're getting into as far as times of competitiveness or times where their stress levels may go up because they're sensing that there could be kind of a competitive or a dangerous situation. And I would compare this a little bit to our flight or fight kind of response in humans. Part of that is based off of things like cortisol levels being raised, as well as others. But that stress indicator of cortisol increasing shows that they're somewhat aware, given the fact that it's happening even before they go out on boundary patrols or before they go out on hunt. And then the testosterone levels also going up, kind of follow suit, other than during the hunts, as I mentioned, when they actually decrease. And this shows what I believe is kind of their natural indication to be ready for confrontation in those situations. Another thing that I wanted to bring up here is that it does make sense. She mentions that when they're in larger groups, the cortisol levels will actually drop or the stress levels will drop. And I think that just connects back to the idea of safety in numbers. The second concept that we're going to talk about is the brood parasites. And in this case, I'm going to be talking about the screaming cowbird. The screaming cowbird is found in South America, and it can be found all across Paraguay and Uruguay, as well as central Brazil, northeast and central Argentina, and southeast Bolivia. The host species that they typically use the most are called baywings. And that's actually a bird that looks very similar to them, and that's something I'll touch on the next slide as well. They also use the choppy blackbirds and brown and yellow marsh birds as host species as well, but the baywings are definitely their preferred species. You can also see the map here that shows their geographic range, and the reason that I point that out before I move on is because when I talk about conservation on the next slide, understand that this geographic range has actually grown in the last couple of years because of deforestation. They've spread out to find new areas to live, but that's still considered their main range that they live within. Some of the unique adaptations of the screaming cowbird are that their offspring will actually use visual mimicry of their baywing host. And this is in multiple facets. So they're about the same size. They also use or have the same coloration, and they'll even match the plumage of those baywing hosts, so that visually they pretty much look just like the offspring of an actual baywing. Even their eggs are pretty similar, and that obviously is the first step in getting the baywings to kind of buy into taking care of the offspring or the eggs of the screaming cowbird. One other interesting thing is that they have a begging call, which is almost identical to the baywings. And the scientists in the study I looked at were actually able to compare them and find that they had about a 90% match rate. So they're almost undiscernible for the baywings. And so even when the offspring of the screaming cowbird are using those calls, the baywings will actually think that it's their young. As far as conservation, like I mentioned on the last slide, there is deforestation in that area of South America. A lot of us are very aware of the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest, which is somewhat in that area. But even though there's deforestation going on, it hasn't really lowered the numbers of the screaming cowbird or impacted them in a way where they become threatened or endangered. It simply distributed them into other areas that they previously were not before. So in recent years, they've kind of grown that range or circle that you saw on the last slide. But as far as their specific conservation status, they're actually listed as least concern, which is the lowest that you can be on that scale. So they're not really considered endangered or in danger of having their numbers affected, even with issues like deforestation going on. The next thing I want to talk about is how male clownfish will care for their young. So looking at different species where the males will, partake in just as much or more of the parenting as the females. The clownfish is a great example because it's a well-studied example of how males in a species will care for the young. You can see the picture there from Finding Nemo. That's just a popularized or kind of an example that people who may not know as much about this topic may have seen it there. And of course, it being in a movie, they take some leeway and do things for the effects of making a good movie. But the idea that a male clownfish would actually be the one caring for the young, it is actually a real thing. In the movie, of course, Marlin's wife or Nemo's mother is killed and the rest of the eggs are eaten. And that's what forces Marlin into taking care of Nemo. In reality, a real clownfish, the male would still be the one primarily taking care of the young, even if the mother was present. And some of the ways in which they would care for their young, mouthing is an example. This is where they clean the eggs using their mouth. They'll actually remove bacteria or anything that has gotten on the eggs that may keep them from remaining healthy. Fanning is another thing that they do, and this is where they can help break the eggs open by actually fanning their tails and helping them to hatch. And I should mention that mouthing is also where they'll physically pick up eggs that have gone bad or been damaged and remove them from the group so that it doesn't become a health hazard for the rest of the group. And then the last thing, of course, is just the general protection of the clutch from any sort of other predators and fish. They'll try to scare them away or keep other fish away from the area in order to protect their young. And one of the ideas behind why male clownfish may be this way is the idea of plasticity, which is where individuals will take environmental changes and modify their behaviors accordingly. In clownfish, females tend to be more involved whenever they're in a larger anemone with a larger group of fish and there's more eggs that have been laid. But typically, and this is certainly not to say always, but typically, clownfish groups in an anemone are smaller groups. Sometimes even just that one set of clownfish will live in a single anemone. And because of this, that tends to have the males be more active. The biggest thing, though, to see here is that male clownfish have larger and more numerous isotonic receptors. And these isotonic receptors are a key piece in receiving the chemicals which promote parental behavior. So because they have more of these and they're larger, they receive more information, it tends to make them more parental in nature. One last thing to mention as far as why male clownfish may be more parental is because all clownfish are actually born male, and then the largest one in the group will evolve into a female. And so they all are kind of innately born with some of those rearing senses that a female would typically have. they're all kind of hardwired into the males already. Even though they still, go through a physical change transformation to become a female, there has to be some of that kind of built into them since they have the ability to become a female. And so there's some scientists and studies that have shown that that has part of the reasoning of why male clownfish show more parental care than females do, which is not typically what we see in a lot of other species. The last thing we want to talk about is human behavior, and I looked specifically at how nature improves our mental health. You can see the name of the study here along with the authors, but the overall goal of this study was to see if nature-based treatments showed positive impacts on individuals who had poor mental health or even poor physical health in some of the examples. One thing I do want to note quickly is that this was a scoping review and not a direct study, so they didn't pull a group of people, do the study on them, and then get the results. They actually looked at a group of 39 other studies, and it started much more than that. We'll see that in 1 second. And they took the results from those studies to get to these results that they provide at the end. I chose this topic because I work in the mental health field, and I've seen a lot of positive correlation with people being outside and connecting with the outdoors, and then because of that, having better mental well-being, and then being interested in a natural field now. It's always good to see that there's positive benefits between, human interaction with nature and our mental well-being or mental health from that. And I am a firm believer that, a connection with nature can play a huge part in our well-being and mental health. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this one because this is not directly from this study, but there are a couple things that you'll see, such as reduced stress levels and better physical health and moods here in some of the coming slides. So as I mentioned, what the researchers in this study did is they took just under 1,000 different studies, 952 studies from databases, various databases, and then they narrowed them down to see which ones met the qualifications they were looking for in this review. And then they wound up with 39 studies, and they did full text reviews of those studies to find these correlations between our mental health and if there was any sort of correlation that could be made with that mental health and natural interactions or different treatments through natural interactions like these nature-based health interventions that you see on the right. So of course, I'm not going to read through all of those, but you can see some of the examples like kayaking or viewing nature, citizen science, nature-based art workshops. These are just examples from all the different studies that they had of different nature-based health interventions, or NBIs, as you'll see them called in the coming slide. This also shows you a graph of where the studies came from, and you can see that actually the majority of them did come from the US. The slide here on the right shows that mental health, physical health, and cognitive health all had mostly positive impacts as far as nature-based interventions, and very little negative impact, especially when you look at mental health. Only 2% of them showed negative impact due to having a nature-based intervention. And so this definitely shows a clear correlation between those nature-based interventions and better mental, physical, and cognitive health. Another interesting thing is that mental health was actually subdivided into 4 categories, which was psychological, emotional, social health, and then stress levels. Improvements that they saw, you can see a whole list here. Again, I'm not going to read through all these, but I already mentioned some of them, like mental health, psychological health, stress levels, and then things like motor functioning and fatigue levels were also found to have improved due to connections with nature. This one I won't read all the way through as well, but you can see how they subdivided mental, physical, and cognitive health, and then some of the subcategories that they found connections with, and some of the positives. So like with mental health, biodiversity was one of the positives they found, or wild environments. And those were kind of the modalities that they were able to break things into. The final conclusions from this study again, research shows that MBIs definitely provide positive outcomes when it comes to people's mental, physical, and cognitive well-being. The other interesting thing is that 92% of those studies that they went through showed consistent improvement. So this was not just a one-off. These were people who continuously got better and were continuously able to prove that those NBIs were providing positive outcomes. And you can see the source there for that study. And then, of course, here's my works cited page. Thank you.